The shadows have stories to tell, but not everyone dares to listen. They whisper in the dead of night, waiting for someone brave enough to hear them. Tan was a master of deception. He never studied, yet his grades were always perfect. His secret, a tiny folded cheat sheet tucked in his palm during every test. It was his lifeline, and no one had ever caught him. Until one day, during the final exams, he felt a chill down his spine. Looking up, he saw a girl sitting in the front row. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't in his class. And yet, she watched him. When the test was over, he unfolded his cheat sheet and gasped. The words had disappeared. In their place, strange symbols had burned into the paper. Then the ink bled from the sheet onto his hands. He tried to wipe it away, but it only spread, seeping into his skin, embedding itself under his nails. That night, Tan tried to write an apology letter to his teacher, but the letters on the page twisted into nonsense. His texts, his notes, every word turned into symbols only he could see. His perfect grades? Useless now, because no matter how much he tried, he could no longer read or write. He rushed to the hospital, hoping for an answer. Doctors called it a psychological block, but Tan knew better. The girl had done this to him. He tried to find her, asking his classmates, searching old records, but no one remembered her. It was as if she had never existed. Desperate, he returned to the classroom late one night, clutching an old test paper. He whispered an apology into the silence, hoping she was listening. The overhead light flickered, and for a brief moment he saw her reflection in the window, smiling. The next morning he woke up able to read again, but he never dared to cheat after that, because he knew she was still watching. Mint ruled the school through fear, a queen of whispers and cruelty. She thrived on humiliation, turning others into jokes. But she never expected to become one herself. One evening, Mint was alone in the bathroom, fixing her makeup. That's when she heard it, a whisper, faint and mocking, her own voice repeating the insults she'd thrown at others. She spun around. The mirrors reflected not just her own face, but distorted versions of herself, sneering, laughing. Each version echoed her past taunts. Ugly. Worthless. Better off gone. She tried to run, but every hallway led back to the bathroom. Her reflection multiplied, surrounding her, whispering louder and louder. She screamed for help, pounding on the stall door, but no one came. The laughter swelled, deafening. Her own face twisted and warped, her features blending into the very people she had tormented. When the school janitor found her the next morning, she was curled up on the floor, staring blankly at the mirror. She never spoke again. Some say the mirrors in that bathroom still whisper at night. If you stand in front of them alone, you might hear a voice. And if you've ever bullied someone, it just might be your own. B was always there, always listening, always following, but never truly seen. Her so-called friends barely noticed her presence, until the day she vanished. At first, no one cared, but then, strange things started happening. One friend swore they saw B standing outside their window at night. Another received a text from her number. "Did you forget me?" One by one, her friends' profiles vanished from social media, their names erased from school records, until the only one left was the last friend who ignored her. That friend began hearing whispers, their own names spoken softly at night. Footsteps followed them down empty hallways. One day they woke up and found an old class photo on their desk. Only now B was standing beside them, smiling. Then they started seeing her everywhere. Reflections, passing windows, shadows in crowded hallways. The whispers grew louder until they finally called out her name. The next morning, their desk was empty. Their name, too, was forgotten, and no one remembered them anymore. When the substitute teacher arrived, the class didn't think much of it. Teachers came and went all the time, but something about her felt different. Her eyes, dark and knowing, seemed to peer right through them. And when she spoke, her voice carried an eerie calm, as if she already knew the answers to every question. The lesson began normally, at first. Then, one by one, she called students to the front. Each time, secrets appeared on the whiteboard. She never asked them to speak. She simply wrote. And somehow the words cut deeper than any punishment ever could. Then she turned to the students who had laughed at others' pain, mocked the weak, or ignored the cries for help. "Now let's see what they say about you," she murmured. Words scrawled onto the board on their own, a cruel tally of all their sins. One student ran to erase them, but the chalk wouldn't budge. The words only grew darker, sharper. Another tried to flee the room, but the door wouldn't open. The lights flickered and the walls felt like they were closing in. The whispers began, low at first, like the murmur of wind through old halls. But soon they became distinct, the voices of those they had wronged, accusations, pleas, cries for help that had once gone ignored. One student, a boy who had spread vicious rumors, clutched his ears, shaking. "I didn't mean it," he whispered. Another, a girl who had turned a blind eye to bullying, found her own name written over and over again on the board, each letter burning into her vision. The substitute watched in silence. She never scolded, never punished. She only revealed what had already been done. Then, just as suddenly as she arrived, she was gone. No one saw her leave. The door unlocked, the lights steadied. The room was silent again. But the board remained, the words remained. And students still swore, even years later, that at night, the chalk moved on its own, writing new names, adding to the list. And if you stayed too long in that classroom after dark, you might just see your own. He stood on the rooftop, breathing shakily, staring at the drop below. No one knew his name. No one cared. He had spent years walking through the halls, a ghost among the living. But tonight, he thought, he would finally disappear. Until she spoke. "If you vanish, you become nothing. But if you stay, you can change your story." Her voice was calm, knowing. He turned and saw her, dark eyes watching him, a small smile that held secrets. He didn't know her, and yet she felt familiar. Something in the way she spoke made him hesitate. He took a step back from the edge. The wind howled around them, but she stood still, unaffected. "Good choice," she murmured, then walked away. The next day, people finally saw him. Teachers called on him in class. Students greeted him in the hallways. It was as if he had always been part of their world. But at night, he felt drawn back to the rooftop. The wind whispered his name. And sometimes, when he looked down, he swore he saw shadows moving along the pavement, shadows with no one to cast them. Weeks passed, and the girl who had spoken to him vanished from the school. No one remembered her. Not a single mention in the yearbook. Not even a record of her enrollment. But he remembered, and the rooftop still called to him. One evening he stood there again, feeling the weight of the air around him. "Do you want to be remembered?" The voice was softer this time, almost inviting. He turned sharply, but there was no one there. The next morning, students found something new on the rooftop, his name carved into the concrete, deep and jagged as if done by unseen hands. Some say, if you stand there long enough, you might hear the voice too. And if you answer yes, you might not like how she makes it happen. Riley had been playing Eden's Nexus for months. a VR RPG known for its deep lore, enigmatic AI, and hauntingly immersive environments. She wasn't the best player, but she had carved a niche for herself, uncovering obscure secrets, hidden NPCs, and lore that most players overlooked. The game's world was vast, ancient ruins swallowed by glowing fungi, floating islands bathed in eternal twilight, and the ever-present whisper of something lurking just beyond the code. One night, a message appeared in her inbox. "You have been chosen. Find the anomaly." It had no sender, no timestamp, just those words. She ignored it. Random spam messages happened sometimes, usually from rogue modders trying to stir up rumors of hidden content. But the next day, something changed. She was running a dungeon, the Howling Crypts, with some guildmates when something caught her eye. A player standing motionless in the dark corner of a chamber. Their username was a garbled mess of symbols, flickering in and out like a broken neon sign. You guys seeing this?" Riley asked in voice chat. "What?" one of her teammates responded. "Seeing what?" "The player just standing there." "There's no one there, dude." She walked closer. The avatar was all wrong. Its textures flickered, its limbs moved slightly out of sync, as if the model was incomplete. Then the head snapped toward her. Riley gasped. The face wasn't rendered. It was a void, an empty, featureless abyss where a face should be. And then the screen glitched, a split-second frame of static. Then another message appeared in the in-game chat. "You see now." Her headset crackled, and for the briefest moment she heard something. Breathing. She yanked off the headset. Her room was dark, the glow of the monitor reflecting her pale face. Her hands trembled as she exhaled, trying to slow her racing heart. Just a glitch, she told herself. Still, when she logged back in later, something was wrong. Her character was no longer in the dungeon. Instead, she stood in the Hollow Library, a forgotten zone, rumored to have been deleted after a failed expansion. The place was unsettling. Towering bookshelves stretched endlessly into the sky, filled with books that had no titles, their pages blank. No enemies, no quests, just eerie silence. And in the distance, the player was standing again, watching. This time it moved, slow, deliberate steps toward her. Riley's hands shook as she tried to log out. Error. Log out unavailable. Her heart pounded. The chat window opened by itself. "Why did you come back?" She didn't type that. She turned and ran, sprinting between the endless rows of bookshelves. The sound of footsteps echoed, not hers. No matter how far she went, the corridors looped back. The game was broken. She was trapped. Then her phone buzzed, her real phone. A Discord notification. Her stomach dropped when she saw the message. Unknown. User. "Stop running." Her headset crackled again. This time the whispering was clearer. "You're already here." She ripped off the headset, gasping for air. Her monitor was still on. The game was still running. But now her character wasn't moving. Something else was controlling her. On the screen, her avatar turned around, not by her input. Slowly, her in-game camera rotated, revealing a shadowy figure standing inches behind her. It wasn't a player. It wasn't an NPC. It wasn't anything that should exist in the game. And then, her webcam turned on. The screen flickered, showing a grainy, distorted view of her own room. Of her, and behind her chair. A dark figure standing just outside the monitor's glow. The final message flashed on the screen. "Welcome to the anomaly." And then everything went black. I used to live alone in a small apartment, nothing fancy, just a cheap one-bedroom unit in a quiet part of town. It was on the top floor with only one other tenant on the same level, an older woman who rarely left her place. One night I woke up to the sound of my front doorknob rattling. It wasn't violent, just slow, almost testing. My heart started pounding. I lived alone. No one should be at my door. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the peephole. The hallway light outside was dim, but I could see something. A figure. Tall, unmoving. "Who's there?" I called out. Silence. Then a voice, low, dry. "Wrong apartment." I didn't respond. I just stood there, listening. And then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of nails dragging down my door. Slow, deliberate. I backed away, gripping my phone, debating whether to call the cops. But after a few minutes, silence. The next morning, I asked my neighbor if she had seen or heard anything. She just stared at me with wide eyes and said, "You too?" Turns out she had seen someone peeking through her keyhole the night before. But when she looked, she didn't see an eye. She saw a wide, toothy grin. That was the last night I slept in that apartment. I lost my sister, Amy, 5 years ago. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit her car. She died instantly. It destroyed me. She was my best friend. But what haunted me the most? A voicemail she left me the night she died. She had called me just minutes before the crash. I didn't answer because I was asleep. The message was 20 seconds of silence. Then a strange, staticky whisper. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sounded wrong, like it wasn't her voice at all. I listened to that message every night, trying to understand. Eventually, I had a friend who worked in audio editing enhance it. What we heard made my blood run cold. Underneath the static, a voice, distorted but clear. It wasn't my sister. It wasn't even human. It whispered, "Don't let it take me." I threw my phone across the room. I refused to listen again. But to this day, I can't help but wonder, what if she saw something in those final moments? And what if it wasn't the crash that took her? I was dog-sitting for my friend while she was out of town. Her apartment was cozy, but something about it made me uneasy. The place was full of mirrors, big, old ones covering nearly every wall. The first night was fine. The second, not so much. Around 2 a.m., I woke up feeling off. You know that sensation when someone's watching you? My skin crawled. I turned toward the mirror across from the bed and froze. My reflection was smiling. I wasn't. I sat up fast, heart pounding. The smile disappeared instantly, like it had never been there. I told myself it was a trick of my sleepy brain and turned over, forcing my eyes shut. But then I heard a tap, a single deliberate tap on the mirror. I left that night, locked the door, and never looked back. When my friend returned, I casually mentioned that her mirrors freaked me out. She hesitated before saying, "Oh, yeah." The last tenant said the same thing. She never explained further, and I never asked. But sometimes, when I look into a mirror too long, I swear I see something watching me back. The town of Black Hollow was no stranger to strange tales, but none were as chilling as the legend of the midnight train. Every night at exactly 3:33 a.m., a train would arrive at the abandoned station on the edge of town. No one knew where it came from or where it was going. The station had been closed for decades, its tracks overgrown with weeds and its platform crumbling with age. Yet the train came without fail, its arrival announced by a distant, mournful whistle that sent shivers down the spines of those who heard it. The train was said to be a gateway to another realm, a place where the lost and the damned were taken. Those who boarded it were never seen again. Over the years, the legend had become a cautionary tale, a story told to keep curious souls away from the station after dark. But for Tom, a man fascinated by urban legends, the mystery was too compelling to ignore. He had spent years researching the train, and one night he decided to see it for himself. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, Tom waited at the station. Right on time, the train arrived, its doors creaking open as if inviting him inside. Against his better judgment, Tom stepped aboard. The moment he did, the doors slammed shut, and the train sped into darkness. The passengers were silent, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes fixed on some distant point. Tom tried to speak to them, but they ignored him, as if he weren't there. When the train finally stopped, Tom found himself in a desolate, otherworldly landscape. The sky was a sickly green, and the ground was littered with twisted, skeletal trees. He tried to run, but the passengers grabbed him, pulling him back onto the train. The next morning, his wallet was found on the tracks. But Tom was never seen again. Tom's disappearance left a void in the life of his childhood friend, Clara. She had always been skeptical of the town's superstitions, but Tom's fate shook her to her core. Determined to uncover the truth, Clara threw herself into researching the midnight train. She spent months piecing together fragments of information, uncovering stories that had been buried for generations. She learned that the train had first appeared over a century ago during a time of great tragedy in Black Hollow. A devastating fire had swept through the town, claiming dozens of lives, and the train had arrived shortly after, its origins unknown. Over the years, it had become a harbinger of doom, appearing only in times of great loss or upheaval. Those who boarded it were never seen again, their fates shrouded in mystery. Clara also discovered something else, a name whispered in the oldest records, the conductor. According to the tales, the conductor was the one who controlled the train, a spectral figure who guided it through the void between worlds. Some believed the conductor was a vengeful spirit, punishing those who dared to defy the natural order. Others thought it was a guardian, offering passage to those who had no other way to move on. Clara wasn't sure what to believe, but she knew one thing. If she wanted to find Tom, she would have to face the conductor. On the night she decided to board the train, Clara prepared herself in ways Tom never had. She carried a silver locket, a gift from her grandmother that was said to ward off evil spirits. She wore a coat lined with herbs believed to protect against curses, and in her pocket she carried a small, leather-bound journal filled with every piece of information she had gathered about the train. The train arrived as it always did, its mournful whistle cutting through the silence of the night. Clara stepped aboard, her heart pounding in her chest. The interior was just as Tom had described, cold, lifeless, and filled with the hollow-eyed passengers. But Clara noticed something he hadn't mentioned. The mirrors lining the walls didn't just reflect the passengers, they seemed to show glimpses of their past lives. In one, she saw a man holding a child's hand, their faces filled with joy. In another, a woman stood at the edge of a cliff, her eyes filled with tears. Clara realized that these weren't just passengers, they were souls, trapped in a purgatory of their own making. As the train sped through the darkness, Clara made her way to the front of the car. She had to find the conductor. The journey felt endless, the train moving through a void where time and space had no meaning. Finally, she reached the door to the engine car. It was locked, but as she touched the handle, it clicked open on its own. Inside, the conductor stood with his back to her, a tall, shadowy figure clad in a tattered uniform. His presence was overwhelming, a force of nature that made the air around him crackle with energy. Clara hesitated, but then she spoke. "I've come for Tom," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I know he's here. Please let him go." The conductor turned slowly, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. His face was both human and not, his features shifting like smoke. His eyes burned with a cold blue light, and when he spoke, his voice was a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through her very soul. "The train does not release its passengers," he said. "They board of their own will, and they remain until their journey is complete." But Tom didn't know what he was getting into, Clara argued. He didn't understand. Please, there has to be a way. The conductor studied her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out an ancient pocket watch. He held it out to her, the face cracked and the hands frozen in place. "Time is the key," he said. "If you can restart the watch, the train will stop, and you may take him. But be warned, once the watch starts, it cannot be stopped. You will be bound to the train just as he is." Clara took the watch, her hand shaking. She didn't know how to restart it, but she had to try. As she fumbled with the mechanism, the train began to slow. The passengers stirred, their hollow eyes turning toward her. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Finally, with a soft click, the watch began to tick. The train came to a halt, and the doors opened. Clara rushed to find Tom, her heart pounding. He was there, sitting among the passengers, his face pale and lifeless. She grabbed his hand, pulling him to his feet. "Tom, we have to go," she shouted. He looked at her, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Clara, what are you doing here?" "I'm here to save you," she said, dragging him toward the door. But as they stepped onto the platform, the conductor appeared before them, his form towering and menacing. "You have restarted the watch," he said. "The train cannot leave without you." Clara's heart sank. She had known the risk, but she hadn't fully understood what it meant. She looked at Tom, then back at the conductor. "Take me instead," she said. "Let him go. He doesn't belong here." The conductor considered her offer, his glowing eyes narrowing. Then he nodded. "Very well. But remember, once you board, there is no return." Tom protested, but Clara pushed him toward the open doors. "Go," she said. "Live your life. Don't let this train take anyone else." As the doors closed and the train began to move, Clara watched Tom disappear into the distance. She felt a strange sense of peace, knowing she had saved him, even if it meant sacrificing herself. The passengers around her were silent once more, their hollow eyes fixed on some distant point. Clara sat among them, the ticking of the watch echoing in her ears. The midnight train continued its journey, carrying its new passenger into the void. And though Clara was never seen again, her sacrifice became a part of the legend, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, there is always a glimmer of hope. The train still comes every night at 3:33 a.m., its mournful whistle a haunting melody that echoes through the town. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you might hear the faint ticking of a watch, a reminder of the girl who dared to defy the conductor and save a soul from eternal damnation. In the heart of a small, forgotten town, shrouded by dense woods and veiled in an air of melancholy, stood an abandoned house. The locals called it the Whispering House, a name that sent shivers down the spines of even the bravest souls. For decades, the house had remained untouched, its windows shattered, its roof sagging, and its once white paint now a dull, peeling gray. But it wasn't the decaying structure that frightened the townsfolk. It was the whispers. Every night, faint, unintelligible murmurs could be heard emanating from within the house. Some claimed the whispers were mournful, as if the walls themselves were grieving. Others said they were angry, filled with a rage that chilled the blood. The whispers were not constant. They came and went, ebbing and flowing like the tide, but they were always there, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within. The house had been empty since the 1950s, when the Johnson family, beloved members of the community, vanished without a trace. The Johnsons had been a cheerful, hard-working family. Thomas, the father, a carpenter; Margaret, the mother, a schoolteacher; and their two children, Sarah and Michael. They were well liked, but rumors had swirled about strange occurrences in their home. The family claimed to hear voices in the walls, whispers that no one else could hear. They spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of doors slamming shut without explanation, and of a cold presence that seemed to follow them from room to room. One night, the entire family disappeared. The house was found empty, the table set for dinner, the food untouched. The only clue was a single word scrawled on the living room wall in what appeared to be charcoal: leave. The townsfolk were baffled. Search parties scoured the woods, but no trace of the Johnsons was ever found. The house was sealed shut, and over time it became a place of fear and superstition. As the years passed, the legend of the Whispering House grew. Some claimed the house was cursed, built on land that had once been a burial ground for a forgotten tribe. Others believed the Johnsons had angered a malevolent spirit, and their disappearance was its revenge. Whatever the truth, the house became a magnet for thrill seekers and paranormal investigators, though none dared to stay long. One investigator, a man named Harold Grayson, spent a single night in the house in the 1970s. He emerged the next morning, pale and trembling, muttering about voices in the walls and eyes watching from the shadows. He refused to speak of what he had seen and left town the same day, never to return. In the 1990s, a group of teenagers broke into the house on a dare. They lasted less than an hour before fleeing in terror, one of them swearing he had seen the ghost of a young girl standing in the hallway, her eyes hollow and her mouth twisted in a silent scream. Despite the stories, no one had ever spent an entire night inside the Whispering House. Until Emma. Emma Carter was a thrill seeker, a young woman with an insatiable appetite for adventure. She had explored abandoned asylums, haunted cemeteries, and crumbling mansions, always searching for that next adrenaline rush. When she heard the stories about the Whispering House, she knew she had to see it for herself. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a sense of bravado, Emma arrived at the house just as the sun was setting. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay, and the house loomed before her like a specter. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding, but then she pushed open the creaking back door and stepped inside. The interior was a time capsule of the 1950s. The furniture was draped in yellowed sheets, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper adorned with faded floral patterns. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the beam of her flashlight. The floorboards groaned under her weight as she made her way to the living room, where she set up her camera on a tripod. As the hours passed, the house remained eerily silent. Emma began to wonder if the stories were just that, stories. But then, as the clock struck midnight, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But soon, they grew louder, forming words. Get out, before it's too late. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She told herself it was just her imagination, but then she felt it, a cold breath on the back of her neck. She spun around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the halls. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around her. Panic set in as she realized the door was gone, replaced by solid wall. The windows were sealed shut, the glass unbreakable. The whispers turned to screams, a cacophony of voices pleading, begging, warning. Emma stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering. Shadows moved on their own, twisting and writhing like living things. And then she saw it, a figure emerging from the wall, its form shifting and indistinct. It was a man, his eyes hollow, his mouth twisted into a sinister grin. Emma screamed, but no sound came out. The figure reached for her, its fingers elongating into shadowy tendrils. The last thing she saw was the camera's flash as it captured her terrified face, the shadowy hands closing in around her. The next morning, Emma's camera was found on the porch, its lens cracked and its memory card corrupted. The last photo, the only one that could be recovered, showed Emma's face frozen in terror, her eyes wide with fear, as shadowy hands reached out from the walls. Emma herself was never seen again. To this day, the Whispering House stands as a grim reminder of the town's dark past. Passers-by claim to hear faint whispers coming from within, and sometimes a voice pleading for help. Some say it's Emma, trapped in the house, her spirit bound to the walls. Others believe it's the Johnsons, still trying to warn anyone who dares to enter. The house remains abandoned, its secrets buried within its walls. But one thing is certain. The whispers are real, and they are waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to listen. Lily had always been drawn to the mysteries of her grandmother's old house. It was a sprawling, creaky Victorian home nestled at the edge of a dense forest, its walls whispering secrets of the past. When her grandmother passed away, leaving the house to her, Lily saw it as an opportunity to start fresh, away from the chaos of the city. She had no idea that the house held more than just memories. It held a presence, one that had been waiting for her. The porcelain doll was the first sign that something was wrong. Its discovery in the attic had been accidental, buried under a pile of dusty quilts and forgotten trinkets. The moment Lily picked it up, a chill ran down her spine. The doll's glassy blue eyes seemed to glint with a strange intelligence, and its cracked porcelain face bore a smile that was both sweet and sinister. Despite her unease, Lily couldn't bring herself to throw it away. It felt significant, as if it belonged to the house in a way she couldn't quite understand. The strange occurrences began subtly. At first, it was just the footsteps, soft, rhythmic thuds above her head as she tried to sleep. She told herself it was the house settling, the wind rattling the old beams. But then the doll started moving. She would leave it on the attic stairs, only to find it perched on the windowsill in her bedroom the next morning. Its head would tilt slightly, as if observing her, and its cracked smile seemed to widen every time she looked at it. One night the laughter began. It was faint at first, a childlike giggle that echoed through the halls. Lily followed the sound, her heart pounding, until she reached the attic. There, in the center of the room, sat the doll. Its head was turned toward her, its glassy eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the attic window. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She grabbed the doll, shoved it into an old wooden box, and locked it away, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The next morning, the box was empty. The doll was back in its original spot, its dress slightly more tattered, its smile slightly more pronounced. Lily's fear turned to desperation. She tried everything, burying it in the garden, throwing it into the river, even burning it in the fireplace. Each time the doll returned, always closer, always more menacing. It was as if it were feeding off her fear, growing stronger with every failed attempt to destroy it. One evening, as Lily sat in the living room, she noticed something strange about the house itself. The walls seemed to hum faintly, and the air grew heavy, as if the house were alive. She found herself drawn to the attic again, where she discovered an old journal hidden beneath the floorboards. It belonged to her grandmother, and its pages were filled with frantic scribbles about the doll. Her grandmother had called it Eleanor, a name that sent a shiver down Lily's spine. The journal spoke of rituals, of binding the doll to the house, of a curse that could never be broken. The final entry was a warning. Do not let her out. She will take you, as she took me. Lily's hands trembled as she read the words. She realized now that the doll was no ordinary toy. It was a vessel, a conduit for something far darker. Her grandmother had tried to contain it, but the curse had never been fully broken. And now it had chosen Lily as its next victim. That night, Lily woke to the sound of her name being whispered. She opened her eyes to find the doll sitting on her chest, its cold porcelain hands gripping her shoulders. Its mouth moved, forming words that sent ice through her veins. "You're mine now." She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The doll's eyes glowed faintly, and the room seemed to spin as Lily felt herself being pulled into a darkness she couldn't escape. When the sun rose, the house was silent. The doll sat on Lily's bed, its smile wider than ever, its eyes gleaming with a newfound light. Downstairs, the front door creaked open, as if inviting someone new to enter. And in the attic, the journal lay open to a fresh page, its words scrawled in a handwriting that wasn't Lily's. "She's mine now. Who's next?" Months passed, and the house remained shrouded in silence, its windows dark and its halls empty. The doll sat motionless on Lily's bed, its porcelain face frozen in that unnerving smile. But the stillness was deceptive. The house was alive, its walls humming with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, as if it were waiting, biding its time. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, a car pulled up to the gate. A young man named Ethan stepped out, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets as he surveyed the property. He was a freelance photographer, drawn to the house by its eerie beauty and the rumors that surrounded it. He had heard stories about the old Victorian home at the edge of the forest, stories of disappearances, of strange laughter echoing through the halls, of a curse that no one could explain. To Ethan, it was the perfect subject for his next project. He pushed open the creaky gate and made his way up the overgrown path to the front door. The key he had obtained from the real estate agent turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open with a groan. The air inside was heavy, carrying the scent of dust and decay. Ethan stepped inside, his camera slung over his shoulder, and began to explore. The house was a photographer's dream. Sunlight filtered through the cracked windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. The walls were adorned with faded wallpaper, and the furniture was a mix of antique pieces covered in dusty sheets. Ethan's camera clicked as he captured every detail, from the intricate carvings on the banister to the cobwebs that draped the chandelier in the dining room. But as he ventured further into the house, he began to feel a strange unease. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. He told himself it was just his imagination, but the feeling persisted. When he reached the attic, the unease turned to dread. The doll was there, sitting on a wooden chest in the corner. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow him as he approached, and its cracked smile sent a shiver down his spine. Ethan hesitated, then lifted his camera and took a photo. The flash illuminated the attic, and for a brief moment he thought he saw the doll's head tilt slightly, its smile widening. He shook his head, dismissing it as a trick of the light, and continued his exploration. That night, Ethan decided to stay in the house. He set up a makeshift bed in the living room, using a sleeping bag and a few blankets he had brought with him. As he lay there, the house seemed to come alive around him. The walls creaked, the floorboards groaned, and the wind outside howled like a mournful wail. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just an old house doing what old houses do. But then he heard the laughter. It was faint at first, a childlike giggle that seemed to come from the attic. Ethan sat up, his heart pounding. He grabbed his flashlight and made his way up the stairs, the laughter growing louder with each step. When he reached the attic, he found the doll sitting in the center of the floor, its head tilted as if watching him. "This is insane," he muttered, trying to convince himself that he was imagining things. He picked up the doll and shoved it into a nearby trunk, slamming the lid shut. "Stay there," he said, as if the doll could hear him. But when he returned to the living room, the laughter followed him. It echoed through the halls, growing louder and more menacing. Ethan tried to ignore it, burying his head under the blankets, but the sound was relentless. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his keys and bolted out the door, leaving everything behind. Ethan didn't return to the house for weeks, but the experience haunted him. He couldn't shake the image of the doll's smile or the sound of its laughter. He began to research the house, digging through old records and newspaper archives. What he found chilled him to the bone. The house had a long history of tragedy. Over the years, several people had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, their bodies never found. The most recent case was Lily, the granddaughter of the previous owner, who had vanished without a trace. Ethan also discovered references to a curse, a dark ritual that had been performed in the house decades ago. The details were vague, but one name kept appearing: Eleanor. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan decided to return to the house. This time he brought a voice recorder, a thermal camera, and a sense of grim determination. He wasn't just a photographer anymore. He was an investigator, and he was going to get to the bottom of this. When he arrived, the house was just as he had left it. The air was heavy, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward him as he stepped inside. He set up his equipment in the living room and began his investigation, starting with the attic. The doll was there, sitting on the chest where he had left it. Its smile seemed even wider now, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. Ethan ignored it, focusing on his equipment. He turned on the voice recorder and began to ask questions. "Is anyone here?" he asked, his voice echoing through the attic. At first, there was only silence, then, faintly, he heard a whisper. It was so soft he almost missed it, but it was there. A single word, spoken in a child's voice. "Mine." Ethan's blood ran cold. He grabbed the thermal camera and scanned the room. The screen showed a cold spot near the doll, its temperature far lower than the surrounding area. He took a step closer, and the doll's head turned to face him. He stumbled back, nearly dropping the camera. The doll's mouth moved, forming words that sent a chill through his veins. "You're next." Ethan knew he had to act fast. He spent the next few days researching the curse, piecing together fragments of information from old books and online forums. He learned that the doll was a vessel for a malevolent spirit, bound to the house by a dark ritual. The only way to break the curse was to perform a counter-ritual, one that would sever the spirit's connection to the doll and banish it from the house. The ritual required specific items: a silver dagger, a vial of salt, a black candle, and a lock of hair from someone who had been claimed by the curse. Ethan had everything except the hair. He knew there was only one place to find it. That night he returned to the attic. The doll was waiting for him, its smile wider than ever. He approached it cautiously, the silver dagger in one hand and the vial of salt in the other. As he reached for the doll, its head snapped toward him, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "You can't stop me," it whispered, its voice a chilling blend of a child's innocence and something far darker. Ethan didn't respond. He grabbed the doll and began the ritual, chanting the words he had memorized from the ancient text. The doll thrashed in his hands, its porcelain face contorting in rage. The air around him grew colder, and the walls of the attic seemed to close in. But Ethan didn't stop. He poured the salt around the doll, lit the black candle, and held the lock of hair, Lily's hair, which he had found in her grandmother's journal, over the flame. As the hair burned, the doll let out a piercing scream, its body cracking and splintering until it shattered into pieces. The house fell silent. The air grew warm, and the shadows receded. Ethan collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. He had done it. The curse was broken. Ethan left the house the next morning, never looking back. He published his findings, exposing the truth about the house and the curse. The story made headlines, and the house was eventually demolished, its secrets buried beneath the rubble. But as the years passed, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. He would hear faint laughter in the dead of night, or catch a glimpse of a porcelain face in the corner of his eye. He told himself it was just his imagination, a lingering effect of the trauma he had endured. Then one night, he woke to find a single shard of porcelain on his bedside table. It was small, no larger than a fingernail, but it was enough to send a chill through his veins. He picked it up, his hands trembling, and saw the faintest trace of a smile etched into its surface. The curse was never truly broken. It had only found a new vessel, and Ethan knew deep down that he would never be free. Liam had been single for years, tired of modern dating. Then he met Hannah, an elegant, soft-spoken woman with a mysterious charm. She was everything he had ever wanted. Too perfect, almost. Their relationship moved fast. Within weeks, she was staying at his place. But strange things started happening. One night he woke to find her standing by his bed, staring. He laughed it off. Maybe she had trouble sleeping. But then his best friend went missing, right after expressing doubts about Hannah. His ex-girlfriend, too, vanished without a trace. Liam, why are you looking for them? They were obstacles. You don't need anyone but me. He started noticing inconsistencies. She never talked about her past. When he checked her ID, it looked brand new. No history, no records. He decided to investigate further. One evening, he followed her when she left the apartment. She walked aimlessly for hours before entering an abandoned house. Liam hesitated, but crept inside. In a dimly lit room, he found a collection of photographs, each of her past partners, each one missing. In the corner, a chair sat with worn-out restraints, and a cabinet filled with surgical tools. Liam turned to run, but the door creaked shut behind him. Hannah stood there, smiling, holding a syringe. "You love me, don't you?" she whispered. He couldn't scream, couldn't move. As his vision faded, her expression never changed. When Liam awoke, he was bound to the chair he had seen earlier. The walls were covered in pictures of himself, alongside photos of Hannah's previous lovers. Some were dated years ago, others were recent. All of them had X's scratched over their faces. Hannah sat across from him, a scalpel in her hand, her smile unwavering. "Love requires sacrifice," she whispered, "and I've given so much for you already." She pressed the blade against his skin, her touch gentle yet terrifying. "But you're different. You understand me, don't you?" Liam tried to reason with her, but his voice came out hoarse, his body weak. Had she drugged him? His heart pounded as she stood up and walked over to a wooden chest in the corner. When she lifted the lid, Liam's stomach lurched. Inside were remains, bones, mementos from her past lovers, the proof of what would happen to him next. Hannah turned back, tilting her head. "I finally found my perfect match," she whispered, stepping closer. "Now, let's make sure you stay mine, forever." Ethan, an aspiring actor, was invited to a private audition for an exclusive director. He arrived at an empty theater where only one person waited, a woman in a long red dress. Her name was Sumi. "This audition is special," she said. "It's not just for a role. It's for me." He played along, reading his lines, but the script was unsettling, a man falling in love only to be betrayed and punished. As he read, Sumi circled him, whispering his lines back in perfect sync. The final line chilled him. "Now you belong to me, forever." The doors locked behind him. He laughed nervously, but Sumi only smiled. "I've been waiting for the perfect lead." Pain exploded in his leg. He collapsed. Sumi loomed over him, holding a thin wire. "You're the best actor I've ever had," she said. "And the last one." The spotlight above flickered, and Ethan saw shadows moving beyond the stage. Figures, bound and unmoving, their eyes hollow and lifeless. "They were like you," Sumi cooed, "but they weren't quite right." Ethan clawed at the stage floor, his breath shallow. From the shadows, the other performers began to move, their bodies contorted unnaturally, their mouths sewn shut. They reached for him, their cold fingers brushing his skin. "You're the finale," Sumi whispered in his ear. "Your role is special." His screams joined the chorus of silent wails as darkness consumed him. Ethan awoke bound to a chair in the theater's backstage. The air smelled of decay, the floor sticky beneath him. He tried to scream, but a cloth gag muffled his cries. Sumi stood over him, holding a needle and thread. "Every actor needs to be molded," she whispered. "Don't worry, I'll make you perfect." She sewed his lips together, each stitch slow and deliberate. His body trembled, pain radiating through him. She held up a mirror. His reflection was a nightmare, his mouth sealed shut with black thread, his eyes wide with terror. "Now you can't say the wrong lines," she said sweetly. From the shadows, the other actors emerged, their mouths also stitched, their bodies jerking unnaturally like puppets on invisible strings. Sumi clapped her hands. "Show him his part." They descended upon him, forcing him to his feet. A script was shoved into his hands, the pages covered in dried blood. The title read, "Final Performance." Ethan's eyes darted to Sumi. "You wanted fame, didn't you?" she whispered. "Now you'll be remembered forever." The lights flickered, the stage lit up, and the audience, rows of decayed corpses, erupted in silent applause. Mina owned a small boutique, handcrafting beautiful dresses. A man named Daniel became a regular, always fascinated by her work. "I want something special," he said, "something just for me." She made him a custom suit, pouring hours into every detail. The moment he put it on, he smiled. "Now, I'll always be close to you." But something was off. The suit smelled strange. When he touched the lining, something squished. Daniel's fingers traced the lining, feeling an uneven texture beneath the fabric. A seam looked as though it had been stitched shut hastily. His breath hitched as he tugged at the thread. With one sharp pull, the seam unraveled, revealing something damp, fleshy, hair, strands of human hair woven into the fabric. His stomach turned. He scrambled to remove the suit, but the moment he pulled at the collar, he heard a whisper behind him. "That's not just any suit, Daniel. It's made from devotion, stitched with love. Can't you feel it embracing you?" Daniel's breath quickened. He yanked at the sleeves, but the fabric held tight, constricting around him. It clung like a second skin, growing warmer, tightening. He gasped, struggling, as the suit began to pulse as if it were alive. Mina stepped closer, her hands caressing the fabric, covering his chest. "You see, every thread is taken from someone who adored me. I couldn't let them go, so I made them part of something eternal." Daniel felt something moving beneath the fabric, pressing against his own skin from the inside, like fingers crawling over his ribs, an embrace from within. He screamed as the suit pulled tighter, the whispers becoming agonized wails. His body contorted, the threads merging with his flesh. Mina watched with admiration, eyes gleaming. "You wanted something special, Daniel. Now you'll be part of my collection. Forever." Jason had always been drawn to solitude. There was something about being alone in nature that put his mind at ease. No deadlines, no responsibilities, just him and the wilderness. That's why, when he found an old, abandoned hiking trail deep in the pinewood forest, he didn't hesitate to explore. It wasn't on any maps, and the entrance was almost hidden by overgrown brush. But he saw the faint path winding between the trees. It called to him in a way he couldn't explain. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. Birds stopped chirping. The wind didn't rustle the branches. Even his own footsteps seemed swallowed by the earth. Then came the first whisper, software just a breath in the air. Jason paused, listening. Maybe it was the wind threading through the trees. He walked on, but then he heard it again, louder, clearer. Jason. He stopped dead. His breath hitched in his throat. Someone was calling his name. His rational mind fought to make sense of it. Maybe another hiker? A trick of the wind? He turned, scanning the thick woods behind him. Nothing but endless trees. Then, movement. A shadow flickered between the trunks, just far enough away that he couldn't make out a shape. A person. An animal. His pulse quickened. "Hello?" he called out, his voice thin in the silence. No answer. The whispering started again, this time. More voices. Jason, Jason, Jason ... His name repeated in overlapping tones like a dozen mouths whispering at once. A cold weight settled in his stomach. He didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but something was very wrong. He turned back toward the trail, picking up his pace. The trees seemed denser now, the path darker, the air thick with something unseen. And then he saw it, a figure standing deep in the woods, half hidden by the shadows. Too tall, too still. Jason's breath came in sharp gasps. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, it just watched. Then, as if responding to his gaze, it stepped forward. Jason bolted. His heart pounded as he tore through the trees, branches slashing his arms. The whispers grew louder, echoing all around him. The trail should have led back to his car, but it didn't. It led deeper. The trees loomed taller, their twisted branches blocking out what little sunlight remained. The air grew colder, damp with the scent of earth and decay. Jason stumbled, his foot catching on a root. He hit the ground hard, his hands sinking into the soft dirt, and then a hand on his shoulder. Icy, claw-like. Jason whipped around. Darkness, total, suffocating darkness. It pressed against him, filling his ears, his mouth, his lungs. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The forest was gone. The sky, gone. There was nothing but black. And the whispers. You should not have come. You belong to the woods now. A force pulled him downward. His body sank as if the earth itself was swallowing him. Cold dirt crept over his arms, his legs. He thrashed, clawing at nothing. Then, silence. The sun rose over Pinewood Forest, golden light spilling through the trees. A group of hikers followed the main trail, laughing, chatting. One of them stopped. "Hey, what's that?" A backpack lay abandoned in the dirt, half covered in fallen leaves. Nearby there were footprints leading off the path, deep into the woods. But no prints coming back. One of the hikers hesitated, staring into the trees. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he heard something. A whisper, a voice, soft, distant, calling a name. Not his. Jason. The hiker turned, shivering, and hurried to catch up with the group. Behind him, the forest stood still, watching, waiting, listening. You have listened, but the echoes never stop. They follow you in the silence, in the dark, in the places you fear to look. Like, subscribe and stay in the shadows.